So welcome, Francis. So wonderful to have you here for the interview today. A real privilege. Personally, I've been impacted greatly by your books. I want to invoke your mother at the start here, if I may. Her book Celebration, and we'll come back to it later. It was there's a section where she talks about her charism being the gift that she is given to her community, and being a lover of Christ in community and mutual gift giving. That was profoundly moving from your own mother. And if I may, I know we don't know each other, but I hope we're going to get to know each other a bit during the interview. Your books, and in preparation for today, have been a charism and a gift to me personally, and I know to many people. And I suppose, in a way, some of my love for books and their influence on me with my own correlations, I want to offer them back as a paltry offering to you today as a thank you. So I hope that's the level at which we'll be able to talk and exchange today. So, Francis, if we could start... I just set the scene for people listening here. You have attempted what comes to mind is the great Blondin walking the tightrope over Niagara. You've attempted the gymnastics of Christian apologetics above the torrent of new atheism, a little in the past now. And we're doing this sort of desert island discs format. But you've already put a lot of your personal life and your formation out there in public, which is wonderful for us to excavate a little bit today. So that's where we want to start. And with your childhood, you famously map your inner experience of reading. If I want to start here, against the local wood and the local town. Could we start there? Yeah.
Yeah, everybody takes for granted their childhood landscape, because it just is the world to them, and it's only later on you start being able to make comparisons and you see more of the world and you discover what was ordinary and what was in fact deeply weird about the environment you first knew. And in my case, it was probably at the strange end of the spectrum, because we lived in a neat little early 1960s slate-clad staff house on the campus of a new university, Keele, just outside the Potteries. And in terms of buildings, it was like living in a kind of 1960s new town. I thought it was great. My parents, who were both historians, fairly thoroughly despised it as a piece of as an architectural setting, but I didn't know that it was home. But the kind of the new towny kind of concrete and glass and cladding bit of it was only half the experience, because the campus had been built on these rather run-down grounds of a stately home just outside the Potteries. So it was on a hilltop outside the Potteries, behind a long sooty wall, and inside the wall there was basically a forest. It had been one of those kind of grand landscaped parks done by Capability Brown for 18th century squires who struck it lucky. This particular squire had turned out to own a coal mine, so he could afford any number of kind of cascades and things, and we got the kind of ruins of that in the public sector and all overgrown. So 1960s street, cross the road, down some steps, and then there was a forest, and a forest containing kind of artificial cascades and strange little follies and amphitheaters and lakes and things. And that was the kind of the playground, my literal playground, and the playground for my imagination as well. Almost everything I read or imagined as a child took place in the woods just over the road.
Fantastic. I I can imagine the institutional concrete. I know that it well. I grew up on in Luton. I think there's a place, Capability Green, named after Capability Brown, built there. And I tell people I was dragged up on every bit of council estate and housing. So, but it's strange. I still find a great deal of comfort walking through concrete.
Yeah,
because that was the womb of my childhood and all your childhood memories. You just think it's normal, like
exactly.
you say. So and that whole Newtown thing of just concrete from start to finish, because it was all new, wasn't it? So
right. And new and hopeful at the time. I mean, as well, that's the bit that's hard to remember. But anything can be kind of warmed by human familiarity, and I too. I mean, I am fundamentally at home in 1960s Newtown architecture and forests, but I mean,
forests. A mixture of both. My wife still finds it strange that I want to relax. I need a good cup of coffee and some concrete around me, and then I can relax. So, in your memoir from your childhood, where you do this mapping, it's just so much to unpack with you. You talk about this time of a cultural consensus, when things are being rebuilt after the war, and a sort of renaissance in children's literature. And again, your work is, can I just be personal about your work? I found your work quite abductive, in the sense of, I find memoir personally quite difficult sometimes with people, some presumptions that I want to enter into their world. But you sort of have this sleight of hand. I sort of get drawn into your context and situation, and before you know it, I'm seeing through your eyes the things that you're talking about. It's a wonderful way of writing, and get abducted into your own experiences. So when you get to the point where you're talking about puffin books, as the what did you describe them, like the NHS delivering children's literature? How did you describe it in your?
The Department of the Welfare State responsible for the distribution of narrative.
I couldn't remember that, picking up all these puffin books.
Because they were inevitable. Absolutely everything became a puffin book if it was a children's book at that point. So there was one thing, and it just seemed like part of a kind of well-administered world. Public libraries had the hardbacks and loads of them, and for 17.5p you could buy a puffin.
Yeah, and you talk about the quick escalation in price of puffin books, but they did make literature accessible. I mean, one of my own. So I'm going to interpose myself a little bit here. I do remember the provision that was made growing up, even though I grew up in council housing. Libraries, access to music. This aspiration for education. I remember it as a child, and I was a beneficiary of it, and I remember the magic of libraries, and still to this day the smell of books. And I know that you at tough times in life go and get a coffee, but go and find some books. I was just in Folkestone recently. Have you been to Folkestone, Francis?
No, I haven't. There
is one of the most amazing cafes there, Steep Street Cafe, and it's got several thousand books that make up all the walls and the partitions. I was doing a bit of preparation for today, thinking that you might like that place.
I might I write in cafes, so
you do. I was enjoying one of the descriptions I read. You were talking about in your early 30s, how you peruse and pick up books that you don't particularly like, and all that experience that you have with books. For some reason, I imagined that was Waterstones up near Piccadilly when you were doing.
It's definitely Waterstones near Piccadilly when I was a Londoner did definitely feature, but chain bookshops have one kind of pleasure, and little unpredictable independent bookshops and secondhand bookshops have another kind of pleasure. But I miss libraries, and I don't think it's just nostalgia for the kind of the particular decade when I was young. I feel, looking back, that I was in on the kind of the last phase of a more hopeful piece of history in this country, and it makes me angry that that so many of the kind of the upward leading ladders towards towards books and other things have been basically demolished, taken away, neglected, allowed to fall into ruins. And there was something benign about the world I started off in. It was at least trying at various things, and it's not just me. I know it's you as well, but it's a whole generation of people who expected to be able to kind of have a job as a welder, and go and borrow the St Matthew's Passion on 6 LPs from the record library if they wanted to, and those were not incompatible things. It wasn't just a world of kind of market segmentation and thinking that your origin was your destiny in cultural terms. You could, yeah. I miss it. It seems to me to be something. In some ways, it's succeeded, and that's why we don't need those things. In other ways, it's just a loss that has gone away.
Yeah. We talk about bookshops for a little bit now. Bookshops are portals to other dimensions, as far as I'm concerned. So my memory of independent bookstores back in the day, I mean, once I had a bus pass to go to school and some freedom, I could travel from Luton to Dunstable, and there was an independent bookstore, and it was magical because it was, other than W.H. Smith's had a very limited fantasy section, but this independent bookshop had this, what seemed expansive, probably 2 carousels of books, and I would get the bus there. It was almost a pilgrimage. You know, you get on the bus, travel somewhere, pick up these books, go around them, save up your pocket money, buy these books, and then take them home and enter these other worlds. And
that's the thing about the portal quality of both bookshops and the books themselves, that a journey to fetch a book takes you further than it appears on the map. I can remember going to the Newcastle under Lyme Public Library and being in a different place on the bus on the way back because of what I had already started reading. So I don't think the pilgrimage language is wrong. There is a kind of transportation into elsewhere there. I mean, secularized pilgrimage, but these things have blurry boundaries.
I mean, again, I won't dwell too much on me, but I'll ask you about libraries. So my background, I came from a very alcoholic, working class, abusive background, and books they weren't just an escape for me. They were a window into a different way of life. And I remember going in Luton Town, again, massive concrete building, and a children's library. But I managed to sneak up the stairs and walk into the adult library. And it was like I'd never been to church. So it was, I guess, like walking into a cathedral. I mean, just row and row and row. And then all those magical things in libraries, you know, you could walk around a corner and find another set of stairs up to another room where there were more books on, and you never knew what you were going to find. Somehow I managed to persuade the library to give me an adult pass when I was about 10. Because and I would go there every Saturday, pick up books, bring them home and read them on anything. Yeah. The first time I did this, I remember one of my memories, and then I'm going to ask you one of yours. I remember turning up at home at my working class family that aspired to education but also despised the benefits of it. Walked with 20 books through the door, and my mother said, "Who the fuck do you think you are?" And despite that, I remember thinking, I know what I am, and it's in here. And I wouldn't let go of that experience. So, sorry, I'm not wanting to put too much of myself into this, but could you tell me again, because I loved it. I was reading your books, and I'm like, oh, a kindred spirit, someone shaped by books, but it's not just the magic of them and the smell; it's what they do to you.
Yeah,
they are more of your memories.
Mind-altering substances, and such an important part of a child's kind of first discovery of independence, because a child's life is so, if I say confined, that sounds as if I just mean oppressive, but I don't mean that. I mean, necessarily a child's life happens within a landscape given by a whole load of adult choices. That's because, you know, you're a dependent as a child, except in your head. and except when you're reading or watching or imagining or playing. I mean, completely different class background. My parents were in some ways ideally encouraging middle class pro reading parents who never thought it was bad news when I tottered into the house with books up to my chin. On the other hand, still an element of escape in the reading, although what I was getting away from was having a seriously ill younger sister, my sister Bridget, who was born with a congenital condition called cystinosis, which is your body can't process some particular amino acid, so it builds up in your cells, and then your organs start failing. In her case, her kidneys first. So she was born when I was 3, and it all happened just at the point where doctors, it's a really rare disease, and most of the people who've got it have parents who are first cousins of each other, because you need 2 carriers to produce one person who's actually got the disease. So there's a cluster of them in the Appalachians, where I always probably very unfairly imagine everyone playing banjos and looking like each other and wearing dungarees. I'm sure that's hopelessly untrue, and I'm getting that
border of East Tennessee, and I'm sure I could hear banjos. Yeah.
Yes, quite. My parents not related to each other, so they were just really unlucky. And so all this happened just at the point when there was beginning to be a treatment for it at all. She was always going to die, but whereas they had previously always died as babies, fading mysteriously away, they knew what it was. They put her on this kind of near starvation diet, where she mostly lived on sugar water. Basically, it's called dextrose, which was fed her on a drip. So till she was 6 or 7, she always had a little plastic tube coming out of her nose with a piece of sticky tape just there. And she was very slow to walk, although very quick to talk, and very fragile. And she basically disappeared along with my mother into hospital for nearly a year, from when she was sort of 6 months old. So the world was fragile, and kind of demonstrated to have been fragile. It was full of, I mean, averagely complicated people with gifts and drawbacks, the way that humans are, but with kind of hairline cracks running through it, because in a way that was obvious even to a child, there was something big that was only just being coped with. And pattern of my early existence, and some of later existence, there, a sense as a child that this was something that which called for so much kind of love, care, anxiety, compassion, that I couldn't possibly manage it, and it would be much better to turn away into something else. And since, as a child, despite convenient forest just over the road, I was still necessarily kind of living within that real situation. The escape was through the portals of reading. So when I was writing about it in The Child That Books Built, I was not just wanting to celebrate books, although I did very much want to do that. I wanted to talk about the whole range of things books do for you, and do with you, and do to you in some ways, because if you're fleeing into stories and imagination, there is this kind of quality of not just liberating escape, but kind of desperate escape about it. And I wanted to talk about what it was like being a child who read with a kind of slightly desperate hunger, a wish to be gone. And I was the kind of reading child who I went really deep in. People could shout next to me, and I wouldn't hear. That disappeared as an adult. Possibly parenthood is the thing which makes it impossible to concentrate so much that if people shout, you can't hear them. But yeah.
That moment was when I read that in your book, was so, again, evocative for me, and I was just transported back to my, little box room in childhood, because I had a similar memory. I would read for so long. My mother could shout for England and I wouldn't hear her, which in my context was bliss, until she would kick open the door literally and swear and shout at me. And I thought, and you put into words that the silence that a silence I found in reading, of stillness and being centered and at peace. It was a almost sacred experience.
Yes.
I mean, it's funny, you look, and this is one of the questions I want to ask you. You look back at your childhood and you use very different words to describe, the epiphenomena of what's happening to you when you're younger and reading. So you're back there reading books. You beautifully talked about an attention that you knew your sister needed, but you put it elsewhere into the books, or you seem to frame it that way. My question is, with that, pressure and tragedy, do you look back on your younger self with a sense of compassion for what you were facing then? And can I tell you why I asked that question in particular? If I can again put myself in, I have an autistic special needs daughter, and I know my own children often struggle to give attention to their own needs because they think they're insignificant compared to, do you know what I mean? And we're always having to reassure them that just because our daughter needs this extra attention doesn't mean that they're not, I sense, I'm not wanting to overlay that on you, but I wonder if you look back at a younger you and see that.
I do. I see exactly that, or a kind of close cousin of that. And I do feel very sorry for that child. In a way, what I feel most sorry for him, I feel sorry for my parents too, who looking back as an adult now, much older than they were then, I see people frantically improvising who were in their kind of late 20s, early 30s, who had been both fairly solitary people, delighted to find that there was someone like them in the world, got together, started a family, perfectly that thing marriage is supposed to give you, that kind of the ecstatic sense that the ordinary goods can be yours as well, and that there is this universal story that human beings tell about finding the other person who gets you. And it's the most ordinary thing in the world, but then it happens to you, and you think this is astonishing, and then you start to think possibly it's universally astonishing, and everyone who feels this is getting this. But so they did that and got ambushed by they planned to have many children, had me, my mother's bones started giving way, had my sister, and she was terribly, chronically, mysteriously ill, and they had to sort of cancel the large family plan. And then they went from hopefully doing the ordinary things to desperately doing extraordinary things in order to cope. And they were constantly, looking back with adult eyes, they were constantly trying to signal to me that it was okay for me to be upset and to mind. But that's not what I received as a child. The kind of that little boy who I was, felt that he was being cued to perform being the one who was all right. So, which was exhausting in itself. So I alternated as a child between demonstrating that I was the one who was okay, and then when it was too exhausting, disappearing to Narnia or elsewhere. But looking back, I think they were trying their best to make room for me to fall over and be not okay. I just failed to get the signal. Possibly I thought that a kind of duty thought that I was supposed to be demonstrating that I was someone they didn't need to worry about, which I'm sure just made them worry about me more. But I didn't know that, and I do feel sorry for him. I feel sorry for them as well, because my parents, that is, because I suspect I was both present and in some ways kind of out of reach to them. I think I moved myself somewhere where I would feel less, and that they looked at me there and felt a bit powerless to kind of retrieve me. Not, does that make sense?
It does. It does indeed. Thank you.
Yeah.
So I mean, let's encapsulate this in an image that's just come to mind. If you had the ability to write a letter to yourself and put it in a Narnian-esque portal that could travel through time back to you to open and read, then what advice would you give yourself, that younger you, apart from go and play in the woods?
Yeah, quite. I was doing that anyway, so that was all right.
Okay, yeah.
Some of it would just be the standard advice which any rather solitary child would who has grown up into a mostly functional adult, you want to send to yourself, which is there are in fact other people like you. It will take you a while to find them, but you shouldn't worry about your solitude, because there are other people whose solitudes match and are out there, and you will eventually come across them. The strange thing is that as a child, I didn't write anything. I was an insatiable reader, but I was not the kind of writer who at 7 was chewing a pen and trying to do it too. I wanted to receive the stuff. I didn't want to create it. So I would put in a letter to my younger self the startling information that later on you will start making up some of the stuff which at the moment you are mainlining as a customer or addict. I don't know. I would find it probably as hard as my parents did to communicate with that rather kind of sealed off reading child. When my mother died, which was 2014, I found that there were 2 letters for me, which were waiting at the solicitors, which arrived along with. I mean, she had sort of vascular dementia at the end, so she had left me some money to buy a forest, which she didn't actually possess, but which was a very nice thought, and that kind of made the beginning and the end of things join up nicely. It was a lovely impulse of my mother's to attempt to buy me my own wood, and apart from the fact that the money was imaginary, that was great. But there were these 2 letters, and the first one was straightforwardly lovely, because she'd written it in about 2001 when she was just about to have an operation, and it was written but from adult her to adult me, and it was just full of warmth and good humor, and it was weirdly like being kind of waved to from heaven, as if this voice you didn't think you'd hear again was just speaking from the kind of the back row of the communion of saints, going hi, and that was fine. But the other letter she'd written for me when I was 6, and I can't remember what it was that was happening, so it was completely irrelevant to me now and very odd as a piece of time capsuling. And what it said was, it's okay to be very, very angry that I'm dead. And it was written in carefully big handwriting, and I never received any such thing at the time, of course. And looking back, what I see there is an attempt by her at the time to go, son I love in the armchair over there, kind of, there must be some quite large and rough emotions going on behind your forehead as you read and read and read and read some more, kind of, and here is permission from your accidentally dead parent to be upset. And I think that was a good impulse on her part, but I would have been utterly baffled to receive it, because I didn't know I was angry or upset, because the stories worked. I wasn't angry, I was elsewhere. So yeah.
She kept that her whole life, and you received that, read that.
Yeah, I received that in 2014. So that was the year I was 50. I received the letter from my 6-year-old self when I was 50. You see why I brought it up? It's a kind of
It's amazing.
Weird sideways thing to the
yeah. You still carry that 6-year-old with you, don't we? Carry on.
I know, we are onions. We layer upon layer.
Yeah, we are. Gosh, wonderful. You've evoked Narnia already. When did C.S. Lewis and the Chronicles of Narnia come into your life?
I wish there was a nice, clearly defined first reading experience, but I learned to read when I was 6. So it must have been in the year after that, because they weren't the very first books I read, but once I had read them, they were the books with a capital B, the ones that all other books weren't quite as good as. And I said in the Child That Books Built that I basically only read other books because I couldn't always be rereading the Narnia books. And they lasted like that from when I was, 6 going on 7 to when I was 12 or 13, when I needed other things. But I still love them, and they are still alive as one of the kind of foundation layers of my imagination and my understanding of the world too. And I still think they're uncannily marvelous books. I have to be careful how I talk about this, but the nearest I have ever come to writing a letter to my younger self was my, as it turned out, unsuccessful or unwelcome writing of an extra Narnia book, which I did a couple of years ago, and that was a kind of gift for my younger self, because I had so wanted there to be one more Narnia book as a child, and I liked the idea that 50-something writer me would be in a position to provide 10-year-old Narnia loving me with this gift. And I, at least, it didn't work in terms of publication, but it did work in terms of a gift
to you. It's a gift for you.
So I have to be careful how I talk about that.
But yeah, I understand. I want to dwell a little bit with Narnia. It's important to you, very important to me, but just a slight step back. I'm sure I've read somewhere how your voracious reading was also how you learnt to read. Was there some autodidactic process of reading that you went through?
I found it took me a year of school to learn to read. I wasn't sort of quick to pick it up. I'm married to somebody who learned to read at 4 because her father showed her the Cat in the Hat dictionary, and she just sort of went and was gone. And that was not my experience. But I got mumps around my 6th birthday, and I was at home for 2 months, and I taught myself, and then my parents got mumps as well, so that the whole house was a kind of full of sort of shaded, curtains drawn area full of sort of groaning people. I taught myself to read then, from The Hobbit. I mean, it sounds like I'm always a bit. Okay, this is going to come up several times. I end up always feeling slightly suspicious of the way I describe my own previous experience, because experience is wild and loose and complicated and untidy and has multiple kind of colors in it. Whereas to decide to put something into writing, you always have to make it a bit simpler than it is and a bit more linear than it is. And you have to decide what the important things about it are. So it becomes more, what's the word? Unequivocal than actual reality is. And then I'm the kind of person where I start to remember my own descriptions of it rather than the actual memory. So there is a kind of element of kind of self-cannibalization for me about writing about my own experience. The experience gets devoured to get turned into the writing. And in some ways I deeply cherish the things I've never bloody described, because it means they haven't been tidied up into.
I know what you mean. The necessary confabulations become the story that you retell, and then that becomes
exactly. And it is still manipulation, even manipulation in good faith with the best will in the world. And this applies to all sorts of things, including religious experience, which we'll come to later, I expect, which describe it, and in some ways afterwards what you've got is the description rather than the thing itself. So my description of learning to read is now like a kind of slightly insistent kind of finger pointing screen in between me and what actually happened when I had mumps. I worked out how to describe what it was like having The Hobbit come to life. And it was like that, but it probably wasn't exactly like that. And I can't remember what it was like, except that magically books went from being a kind of excluding wall where I couldn't break the code into a portal, from closed door to open door, from thicket of symbols into smooth, flowing, fluid, liberating, wonderful river of images.
It's interesting learning to read, and yet in those, as we trade stories here of the books, it's not the words. Well, it's not the words that I hear you remembering. It's the actual immersive at what happened to you.
Yes,
and you're trying to re-articulate that in words again, which is a strange thing to do, isn't it?
It is. We are offering translations, and they're slightly halting translations, which is true of everything you do with words. Words are great. They are my occupation, and I hope not my idolatry, but sometimes I probably come a bit close. But they're secondary. They actually don't ever do complete justice to the stuff we try to represent. They always leave things out.
Yeah. Well, we'll pick up The Hobbit as well. I saw your necessary progression into books and spotted that trajectory, because we're a similar age. Slim pickings for a while until science fiction space operas came along. But so I've got a memory of Narnia I want to share with you, and it is one of those moments. Again, I may be making it up, but I can remember walking into. I was primary school, couldn't read, and there was a reading circle. So we would sit on a carpet, and the teacher would read a book to us. And either I've conflated a memory from readings with hearing The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe for the first time. But I like to think that the reading of the book locked into my memory the bits that came before it. So my memory is, walking into a room in this brand new primary school on this council estate, the dust motes, in the sun, kneeling down on this carpet, and then listening to The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, first couple of chapters, I think, and never being the same as a person since then. And there was a library attached to my primary school, and I couldn't read, but I do have a memory of going and finding these books from the cover pictures and being determined that I wanted to read so that I could read these myself.
Yes.
And again, I persuaded my mother to get them out the library. And I do have a sort of recollection of a conversation of her saying, but you can't read. And I remember opening thinking, I'm going to learn to, I mean, again, I have to use the language, I'm going to learn to bloody read. But that wasn't what I was thinking. I just wanted to access this in some way as a child. And it came alive.
The bloody is an adult placeholder for a child's intensity here.
I've got no idea what word, if I wouldn't even have any words to use. But, and then for some reason, I decided that, and I sort of did some induction into reading, and the school picked up, I learned to read quickly, but I was desperate to read these books. And then for some reason, I decided that I would read all 7 books 7 times. It seemed appropriate. And I did that, and then discovered The Hobbit after that, and then The Lord of the Rings, and then it was slim pickings. I'll get to your religious experience and faith later, but I did not become a Christian until I was 17, never set foot in a church really until I did. And people used to say to me, how did you go from not being a Christian to a Christian so quickly? It was just a few years later, as still a young man, I realized, oh, Lewis was my catechism. Reading the Chronicles of Narnia 7 times was a wonderful preparation for all the concepts and the metaphysics of life and faith and other things. But anyway, so that's me. Yes.
And there is a lovely parallel between that and Lewis himself saying that George MacDonald quotes "baptized my imagination." I think that's also the process you're describing there, a kind of a baptized imagination.
Yeah. It was, and I knew, and again, in my situation, sorry, that I knew, and we're going to focus on you, I wanted to escape to Narnia because it was, and so for me becoming a Christian, and we'll get to that, I realized I found Narnia. That was my deepest desire, but I just didn't know how to get there, and that it actually was a real place, metaphysically. So I'm just fascinated. So out of all those childhood experiences,
it really worked. Hang on, sorry. It really worked for you. So he no longer looked to them like a lion at the end of the last battle. That just worked for you as a turning point. You thought, okay, he's not a lion, but there he is.
Yeah. I remember the moment. I've got it here up. Took a photo and had printed it because you can't get it printed properly. Of when Aslan dies.
Yeah,
the deeper magic, and I remember the intensity of that moment of going through it in the book, and it was just stunning.
Yeah,
it puts something into the foundations of my soul and my young mind about life.
This is interesting. I think you read it in some respects more completely as Lewis intended it to be read, whereas I responded to it as a child very intensely, but in some ways with the brakes still on. I wanted Narnia terribly as the other place one could get to through wardrobes and paintings, where one was kind of held safely by the shapes of stories themselves, and Aslan was a part of that. But I could feel as a child that the stories wanted me to consent to a kind of further transformation. They wanted you to go kind of onwards and upwards, and I really didn't want to. Narnia itself was what I wanted, and I was very upset as a child by the last battle, because I didn't actually want to consent to be any more transformed. I found it, I think, scary. There was a prospect of kind of self-loss in what the books seemed to be beckoning me onwards to. So I wanted to go this far: glades, centaurs, Aslan, astonishment, lying on the wind like a sofa, and then stop, please. I didn't want to kind of to pass through the further door and think, so he no longer looked to them like a lion. And it wasn't that I wanted to resist the religious dimension of the books, because I was perfectly clear about that, because we were we were a church-going household, and I found that utterly unproblematic. And in fact, in my primary school, when the teacher, well after I'd read the whole series, read us the first chapter of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, and went, "So why do you think we're having this now?" I was the one with his hand up, going, "'Cause it's nearly Easter," which was not what her lesson plan called for at all, and made me very unpopular, and just didn't compute. But so I knew what it was supposed to be, but in terms of much of the journey I was ready to take, I wanted to stop. I wanted to stop in the middle and stay there. And I reread the kind of middle books of Narnia, The Voyage of the Dawn Treader and the Silver Chair, far more than I read either The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe or The Last Battle. Not Crucifixion, ideally, not Resurrection and the New Jerusalem, ideally. I want kind of, I want the middle.
Sorry, this feels like this is some sort of literary therapy, at least for me. Thank you. You're giving me insight into. I do know I didn't understand The Last Battle, no matter how many times I read it and how young I was. I've just started, after having gone through your book, The Child That Books Built. I have not read the Chronicles of Narnia since I was a child, and I've started with some great trepidation to reread them. And now I'm terrified after talking with you today to continue to do that.
No, you shouldn't be. As one kind of Lewis formed person to another here. Okay, these are only predictions which may not come true, but I think what you will notice this time round is that you'll notice it's made of words. You won't notice, it won't work for you just as a portal. You won't stop noticing the writing and just be in Narnia in the same way, because the fall into adulthood has happened, and you will now notice that you are being told a story by a tweedy bloke from the 1950s, and you will notice that in some ways the children don't really have characters, and that they talk a weird antique slang, and they're constantly going "crikey" and "great Scott" to it.
That's what I'm 4 chapters in, and I'm like, exactly that. Yeah.
But
yes, okay.
But it is still kind of bright and truly imagined, and the wonders are still wonders, and the grace is still grace, and I don't think you'll be disappointed. It'll be different. You won't be in Narnia. I think you'll enjoy them as kind of artifacts.
Right. Well, I'm sort of reading it with a view to hoping that I understand The Last Battle when I get there this time.
I think The Last Battle it still seems slightly hasty to me, that in order for Narnia to be ended and remade, he still has to admit very suddenly a whole load of things which were never in Narnia before. Narnia did good and evil, but it didn't really do shades of grey or kind of shoddy bad behavior, or it always did self-deception, because Lewis is so good on self-deception and people telling themselves convenient lies to justify things they want to do. But the whole kind of donkey in a lion's skin, that kind of thing, pretense didn't really happen in Narnia up till then. So I think he shows his working slightly. But
okay.
But
and out of these children in their escapades, was there any that you identified with?
Oh,
I wonder if you were like Edmund, the Turkish delight. You could never have enough of books, or...
I don't think I made that connection, but perhaps I should have done. But I mean, I was everybody in turn. I was more like Eustace than I was because it's impossible to read about Eustace Clarence Scrubb, who very nearly deserves it, without noticing that actually, if transported to another world, really, you might be the one who gets seasick and 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 complains about the lack of electricity and demands to see the British consul. Um, that's really good kind of child-sized satire. But Lucy is, I think Lucy is the one who because Lucy is the one who Lewis is being in Narnia, which for me is always the great thing to set against anything about him being a misogynist. He was in very good touch with his inner little girl, and I think Lewis thought of himself as Lucy in relation to Aslan anyway. So we get to be as well. And
I think I wanted to be Peter.
Did you?
My messianic complex started at an early
Yeah.
age, trying to rescue my family, trying to rescue everyone. I thought, yeah, he was heroic, very heroic.
Yeah. Did you ever find a wolf to slay with the?
Oh gosh, what a question.
Sorry.
Oh, no, sorry, this is supposed to be about you. I feel like I'm having literary therapy, as I said. Do you know, I'll tell you a story. One of the last stories maybe I should share because I want to focus on yours. I had a fur coat from my father in my wardrobe. And one time my parents had one of the biggest fights they've ever had, where they were taking lumps out of each other in the house. My brother, anyway, the police were called, my grandmother came, and I spent all day in the wardrobe and no one knew where I was. And I remember sitting at the back of the wardrobe with this, you know, and I knew that moment from The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, where sometimes the wardrobe was the portal and sometimes it wasn't. And I was just willing the back of the wardrobe to transform. Yeah. And to this day, I still find it very difficult to put on a coat that is furry in nature. So I don't know that if there was one I slayed, it was escape from my household.
Yeah.
And education was that escape. It's ironic, my parents wanted escape and I did it. Sorry, that's my most personal Narnian.
No, that's extremely touching. I'm sorry the back of the wardrobe didn't open for you.
But you see, it did. When I was 17, it did.
Yes.
It opened. And actually, you know, if we talk about faith, so I may have a PhD in theology, but for me, you know, the metaphysics of the kingdom, it's like Narnia is real. The world that Lewis talked about does exist. You know, I got through the wardrobe. So, yes. The Hobbit.
Yes.
I saw a twinkle in your eye and a very big smile. Do you have a memory of how did that come into your life?
The Hobbit was the book I taught myself to read with when I had mumps.
When you had mumps, yeah.
And the Hobbit, I think it goes a lot less deep than the Narnia books, just in terms of the kind of thing it is. But it's very, very good. I mean, think about hobbits. They are half adult height, and The Hobbit is a wonderful book for giving a child a sense that there is something a small person can do, kind of fussing and panicking, but in fact rising to every challenge out into the scary world of dragons and goblins and treasure. I mean, the Hobbit is, you know, like the Lord of the Rings later, is this lovely compound of fussy, homely, domestic person like us. He's a kind of, I mean, Bilbo is an averagely scared, kind of thinks about his breakfast, non-heroic character who's therefore like us, stuck in a fantasy world which is all heroes apart from him. It's a kind of go to the corner shop, have to deal with a dragon kind of story. which
You made it
mapped
sound like a Simon
perfect.
Pegg movie.
Yes. Yes. That's a very good argument, actually. I suggest that in some ways, World's End is probably a film made by somebody who grew up on The Hobbit as well. And in a way, the thing that genre fantasy missed when it became a kind of huge thing after Tolkien was that mixture of the kind of homely and domestic and ordinary with the heroic and epic and stuff. Lots of people have done the epic, but Tolkien was very good at going, and here's a place for averagely frightened you. You're the one creeping along the corridor who, when it comes to it, can deal with Gollum in the pitch dark asking riddles, kind of can deal with Smaug whose eyes are glowing red, which maps very neatly onto that remark of G.K. Chesterton's that fairy tales are valuable for children because not because they tell them about dragons, because children already know that dragons exist. It's because they tell them that dragons can be conquered. And you know, and I know that childhoods come with their own dragons. Yeah, so that and it's a very kind of rough and tumble narrative. Bilbo is constantly being in danger of being kind of incinerated, eaten, kind of and it didn't go in as deep as Narnia, but it makes me happy thinking about it now.
Well, how and when did you make the transition to the Lord of the Rings? Because I found that a massive disjunction. I mean, that was a huge jump. I remember the shock of, I'm ready for the next.
Yeah. My parents had it on the shelf. There were 3 hardback volumes, but with the Eye of Sauron on the cover, which was extremely scary. So I had to take the covers off and the dust jackets off before I could
dust jackets off
bear to read them. I continue to be slightly oppressed by book covers. I told a friend a few years ago that I'd never dared to read Stephen King's Carrie because the cover with the girl with blood trickling down her face was so horrifying, and she presented me with a copy of Carrie on which she'd stuck a picture of a lovely bunch of flowers, and it's true, it worked. It worked.
Fantastic. That's amazing.
Sidetrack. Where on earth was I going? Yes, The Lord of the Rings. It begins Hobbit-like deliberately. It begins with Bilbo and the 111st birthday party, and then it goes somewhere else. And I struggled increasingly as I went along, and I read it so fast eventually that I think I was skipping large chunks of it because it didn't mean very much, and didn't come back to it until much later. Didn't love it the way I'd.
Wow. Thank you. So let's move through school into university. Let me bundle these questions up. What was school like, and what did books mean to you in school? And was school just a holding place till you got to university to do the reading that you?
School was fairly solitary, and there didn't appear to be any other ones like me. I went to boarding school when I was 10, which my parents couldn't. In fact, they really couldn't afford it. But I think that represented their solution to what was due to happen to my sister round about then. And in fact, transplant surgery came along. She had a kidney transplant from my father, and didn't die then. But I was kind of out of the family, and in some ways getting that traditional British upper crust treatment where your feelings recede beneath a layer of charm, and not that I'm doing that now, heavens no. I was deeply homesick at boarding school, so I just read even more. But that led gradually towards a sort of later teenage state where I did start to meet people I got on with, and where the things I read changed as well. I too discovered science fiction around 14 or 15 as my solution to the problem of getting from childhood books to adult books. I found adult novels quite mystifying. They did not do what they said on the tin. I can remember hopefully borrowing a John Updike novel from the adult library because it was called The Centaur, and I'd met centaurs in Narnia, and centaurs were great, and there was no, insert expletive here, centaur in John Updike's The Centaur. It was, as I said in the childhood books book, just some bloody metaphor. And I was rather at sea, but science fiction did make sense when it came along. And that too is a kind of writing that transports and takes you to elsewhere.
Was that all self-directed at that point? You were discovering that, or did you have any book, when I say dealers, as in supplying you your drug of choice through school? Anyone who saw you?
Be self-directed, but when I was doing my A levels, I started to have friends we would pass books to each other. Often books that I now, looking back, think that was crap about. On the Road by Jack Kerouac. What an awful book, really. But at the time, it filled me with a great excited sense that the thing to do was to learn to play the saxophone and drive very fast for thousands of miles without stopping. I mean, one of the differences between my life and your life is that we were a church-going family, and I was uncomplicatedly, kind of compliantly, a childhood Christian until I was 14 or so, and then it went away, and I didn't find it again for myself as an adult until much later. In some ways, kind of characteristic of the kind of Dawkins generation new atheists, in that I thought of it as one of the childish things I'd naturally put away. Now I find that my pattern is fairly unusual. I mean, it's not unusual for kind of adult converts, people who came to Christianity out of nowhere. There are lots of people now who have some crisis in their 30s and find their way to faith as a result of it. But the drop out as a teenager, drop back in again in your mid-30s pattern doesn't seem to be very common. And I can remember being at a church meeting about the importance of stuff for teenagers, where they said, in a kind of, those sort of, let's form breakout groups and discuss this kind of exercises that churches are very fond of, and whoever devises them always has a pretty clear idea about where you're supposed to be going. And they went kind of, I'd like everybody to stand up, and then I'd like you to sit down as we go through the years at which you became a Christian. And by the time they'd got to 19 or 20, everybody but me in the room was sitting down, and then I had to go on standing up for another 15 years worth of things, because I was the only person who was a 35-year-old Christian. But there are advantages to this pattern as well, in terms of...
If I could dig into that a little bit with you. So was it, so I'm hearing an intellectual, I'm not hearing a massive rebellion for you in calling yourself an atheist, or leaving behind childish ways. But that moment, because again, 14, it's impressionable. Well, it's a very important age. I bet you can remember every movie and every song that you listened to back then, or it evokes it when you hear it. But to have that experience and not be able to have that story to tell, did you feel that you had to enter into a different story?
To some extent, a kind of political story. Looking at it, the things that I suppose my religious sense was doing as a teenager. It got compartmentalized and split into different things, and the desire to be taken to elsewhere, to be transported, went off to science fiction. The wish for New Jerusalems and for things to be for the kind of the peaceable kingdom and the lion to lie down with the lamb, and the sort of Amos stuff about justice and equity moved off into very utopian politics, because I was a huge Ursula Le Guin fan, and that turned me into a very theoretical and terribly polite anarchist as a teenager. So hope went off to politics. Elsewhere went into science fiction. Consolation, I don't know where that went. I wasn't a very consoled teenager, though a very polite one. So yes, there was some rebellion, and there was some anger, but it was very pent up and very, very polite. It was mostly a series of silent inner refusals to go along with stuff, and probably a reaction to my self-imposed task as a child to be constantly demonstrating to a worried world that I was all right. I thought, stuff it, I'm not all right, and I'm not gonna prove I'm all right. So being silently not all right was my rebellion, and I did go through a period just before I stopped being willing to go to church at all, at 14 and 15, of finding churches very, very oppressive, as if they were filled with some kind of pressurizing cloud of something, some big bullying, parental, demanding, intrusive thing that wouldn't let me alone, kind of a sort of bad Aslan cloud, an unwanted pressing vapor, and I didn't want to go back in. I found churches very upsetting places.
Yeah, I find it, to this day, I can't understand what it's like to be brought up in church, because I wasn't. And many of my friends who, struggled with their faith, lost their faith. And I guess I felt they realized at some point that the story they were being told that was supposed to be their story wasn't their story, until they found their own one. So I never had that, so for me, I was 17. In fact, one of the way Christianity was explained to me was that life would be harder, but I'd have meaning, adventure, and purpose, something to live for and something to die for. That's not your average presentation. Now, for someone who's grown up on the Chronicles of Narnia, Lord of the Rings, even the Chronicles of Thomas Covenant, the Unbeliever, in my late teens, that was I'm so glad that when someone introduced the Christian story to me, they told it in a way that I could access, and that felt that it made sense of my current story.
Yes, and whoever that was, they knew you quite well.
They didn't know me at all.
Right. Okay. Well, then in that case, that's just.
And to this day, they still don't know why they said what they said in that way. It just was a moment that, I call it a divine moment that didn't screw up the rest of my life. So,
yeah. One of the reassuring things, if I may become explicitly Christian for a moment here, is that you don't have to know where the seed that's being broadcast goes. It's not the responsibility of the person who sows it, which means all sorts of good stuff that they didn't have to mean, didn't have to intend, didn't have to strategize, can happen.
Yeah. And that's where we'll get to your recent book, I think, at the end of this interview today. It presses into that. So let's talk about Cambridge. So what was that like for you as an experience as a student and reading? And
it was miserable. I'm sorry, but
I thought you were going to say,
I have to be honest about the
fundamentally and magical
and uncooperative and spoilt nature of my younger self here. It annoys me immensely, looking back, that I let myself be carried to Cambridge by a kind of educational conveyor belt, in a state of increasingly truculent compliance. I should not, and I'm glad I went to Cambridge because I met my wife there, though it took us a very long time to do that. But apart from that, I was an unhappy, sulky little git at Cambridge, and it was almost completely wasted on me. And looking back on the things I could have got out of it, it is just shameful how much time I spent at Cambridge sort of sleeping till 2 in the afternoon, refusing to go to lectures by great and astonishing people, doing the absolute minimum and going, basically clenching my fists and holding my breath and going, I'm not all right, I'm not all right, I'm not all right. It was not a time I feel nostalgic about at all. It was a kind of vast depressive sulk from which I was very glad to emerge, and somebody else who actually benefited from it should have occupied my space. One of the things that makes no sense to anybody, because it made no sense at the time, is that I wanted to go to another university in order to get away from expectations, but my A levels weren't good enough. I went to Cambridge because my A levels weren't good enough, and at that time, you could take a separate entrance exam.
Oh, okay.
They would let you in or not if they wanted you. And retaking my A levels would have taken me a whole year, and doing the Cambridge entrance exam took me 1 term. So I did that. And honestly,
sorry, now I'm starting to get to know you, if I can be a little cheeky here. So you didn't have a Goodwill Hunting moment with a lecturer who saw you and said, it's not your fault, it's not your fault, and then
no, I didn't. And indeed, I was there were mentors around, and I was deeply resistant to them. In some ways, I suppose one of the long-term effects of my childhood is that I have been an adult who has insisted on being self-taught, and therefore taking the long way round. There are all sorts of very obvious things that I've discovered extremely slowly because of the amount of time I've spent with my fingers in my ears going, la, 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 I can't hear you. And, which makes psychological sense, I think, I found the idea of trusting a mentor enough to let myself be directed scary in exactly the same way that whatever the looming presence inside churches was. I did not want something big and powerful messing with my brain. I wished to be left alone. And it took me a long time in which I laboriously rediscovered things that somebody could just have told me, because I insisted on doing it all myself.
Wow. So in the midst of, as you've described it, your truculence through Cambridge and avoiding things and your privacy, reading English, did any books manage to impinge upon your consciousness at all in terms of impact?
Yes, I'm glad to say that I did actually do the reading.
Okay. Phew. I wanted to know, can you tell us some of the books that that were as impacting as other books may have been? And I also want to know whether there's some that you wanted to, Orwell's Room 101 kind of experience. Can you tell us about both types?
Yeah. Well, I was still, as a student, I was still reading with the kind of slightly unhinged appetite that I was reading as a child, with kind of deep concentration. You kind of look up, 4 hours have passed, that kind of reading. So I read a lot, and slightly randomly, I read almost everything that was published as a picador, and almost everything that was published as a King Penguin, which were the 2 large format kind of. I read, so picador contained Hunter S. Thompson and Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas. It contained Michael Hare on the Vietnam War, but it also contained lots of kind of early mid 1980s literary fiction, Adam Mars Jones and Angela Carter, who was a very big deal. Possibly she was in King Penguin. Angela Carter retelling fairy stories in a kind of profane, kind of bloody and sexual way spoke to me quite strongly. I also read the whole of Italo Calvino, If on a Winter's Night, and Traveller, and all those fictions about fictions, which I loved the kind of shifting levels of them. But I was still reading more or less randomly. I discovered overdrafts as a student, and that you could just go to a bookshop and buy some more books, and then eventually there was a terrible crunch, and you discover that
were all of these superfluous to what you should have been reading for your
mostly
course?
Yes. And yeah. I read the course books, but my actual enthusiasm was reserved for stuff I'd found myself, with again this truculent inner self going, ha, take that. I'm not going to love those. I'm going to love these because I found them. I must have been a bit of a nightmare, actually. And looking back, I'm impressed by how well my various teachers bore with me. And it's one of the ironies of my life that I am now a teacher of writing, and I love teaching, and I love the kind of trusting contact you get with the imagination of the people you teach. And looking back, I would have absolutely refused that. I would have hated me as a teacher, because I am full of those offers that I would have backed away from as a 20-year-old. And I like to think of it as a long, gradual process of becoming kind of sane and patient. There were virtues in it, in that I got used to the idea of finding my own path and doing stuff because it pleased me. And I've never been particularly bothered about being conventional as a writer, partly because I'm just haven't bothered to find out what the conventional choice is, and partly because
we'll get to that when I just like, what genre do you actually write in? Apart from,
I have no idea. My genre.
Yours, yeah, it's great. Well, that's great. Well, this is wonderful, because it helps. It's a precursor to when I get to those questions with you. So, lastly, then, on university, was there anything that you had to read that, other than your general truculence to think, I'm not going to be taken on board by this, that you thought, good grief, this is ridiculous? Something that you would still hold up today and go, yeah, that may have been a course book, but it wasn't. I still don't know to this day why this book is held up with the esteem that it is.
No, there was nothing. I didn't despise things. I was still in flight from sort of real demanding emotion. So looking back, I managed to read George Eliot because you had to, and to treat it almost entirely as a kind of gigantic technical crossword puzzle, a set of kind of things going on to do with form, rather than being what it is, which is immensely wise writing, full of complicated kinds of human understanding and kind of social range and almost universal sympathy, which is now very close to my ideal of what I think fiction should be. I'm still loyal to science fiction in the sense that I like stories that are story shaped, but I think fiction should aspire humbly to be wise where it can, and to show you patiently the ordinary stuff in human lives. And at 20, going la la la, I can't hear you, I wanted to say, George Eliot, a long book full of paragraphs, rather than Middlemarch, an astonishingly humane and funny book. I didn't get a single joke made by George Eliot. I mean, I went back to Middlemarch at 50 and thought, this is glorious, and it's funny, and it's even quite bitchy, and it's really profoundly wise about how human beings deal with each other. And I got none of that. I was deaf to wisdom would be a good way of describing me at 20. A clever little bugger, deaf to wisdom.
Still reading to keep the noise out. Yeah.
Yes. Rather than, and this is the crucial thing, rather than to understand the noise, the point where you start to read in order to be able to interpret the noise is an enormously big deal. And for me, it happened slowly and gradually. I was an extremely late developer in terms of reading to understand my fellow humans, to be taken more closely here where we are rather than to be taken elsewhere.
Yeah. Well, thank you for sharing that. I say in a little preparation for today, and I have various friends that have undertaken English literature degrees, and theirs is often an experience of, this was a magical time of reading and engaging, but then they go on, they get, I don't know any of them that continued with English literature. It was just something they did and then they move on. But as I understand it from your CV, you moved on into a job where you were, I have to ask you, you were paid to read.
I was paid to read.
Just such, I never knew a job like that could exist
anymore.
Does it exist today?
All right. What happened is I got my reluctant English literature degree wasted on me. Sorry. And then I spent a year doing the world's most boring and pedantic job, which was probably good for my soul in some unspecified way, as an indexer of British official publications. It was yeah. Anyway,
I was going to say, it sounds like you're really looking for the stultifying, but that's probably understated.
I was in the company of a bunch of very nice people, all of whom, like me, had degrees in deeply unuseful subjects. I was with people with degrees in philosophy and ancient Greek and Swedish and things like that. And there we all were indexing Ministry of Agriculture and Fisheries manuals about catching Norwegian prawns by searchlight.
And you weren't thinking, these are my people, this is my story.
I thought, well, I really hoped it wasn't my story. But I'd started to write things. I wrote a short story as a student, which won a short story competition and then got published, which I was very, very excited about. It was disastrous because it completely paralyzed me, because I thought, I've already succeeded, so I can't actually learn how to do this anymore. Everything I do now has to be great, and nothing else I could do was great. So I stopped doing it, and then I realized I might be able to kind of creep up on writing by writing book reviews. And the magazine that had published my short story, which remains the only short story I've ever written, my wife refers to it as the collected short story, said you could write book reviews for us. So I started doing that, and then they tipped me off that an old-fashioned publisher called Chatto and Windus was looking for a publisher's reader. And so I moved to London, and I came in at like the very end of the kind of last phase of old-fashioned gentlemanly British publishing: manual typewriters, long lunches, Georgian houses in central London. Except that this one was being run by the fiery Carmen Khalil, who founded Virago Books. So it was a gentlemanly publishing house with a kind of Australian fireball running it. But all the same, they still had the manual typewriters and the long lunches. And until they'd lost so much money that they couldn't possibly afford it anymore, they stuck me in an attic in central London with a gigantic green sort of kind of, I can't describe the green. It was like, it was, the office furniture used to come in that sort of metallic green kind of hope goes here to die kind of color. They put me in an attic with an enormous typewriter, like a kind of organ, which I could kind of play like that, except with two fingers, because I've never learned how to type. And basically through one hatch, they passed novels, and then out of the other hatch, I passed reports on the novels, which I'd pecked out on the manual typewriter. And I knew nothing about the business of publishing, and most of my judgments looking back were complete rubbish. And I do not know why they kept me, but it was an education, and in some ways it was more of an education than doing the literature degree, because I was getting a kind of snapshot of how publishing worked, and of things that were going on in writing. So I was around when Jonathan Coe, who wrote What a Carve Up and lots of other good stuff later on, was still at the beginning of his career. He sent us a novel. Of course, I rejected it. I mean, no, embarrassingly incompetent. But I got given A.S. Byatt's Possession, which won the Booker Prize, to look at. I said we should publish this, but we should brace ourselves for it selling far fewer copies than any of her other books, because it's full of Victorian poetry, and so on. But it was like working in a sweetie factory. It was my childhood dream job, paid to read, not paid very much, but paid to read. And somewhere in the course of that, I kind of started to kind of conceive the idea that I could write books myself, and that there were books I wanted to write, but I didn't dare to write novels because those were too scary and required too much human stuff. But I could think of ways, I could think of non-fiction books that I wished the world contained, and that I might be able to do them. And I exploited terribly my position in the attic with the green typewriter, and was able to propose them a book on one of the pieces of paper I kind of pecked out and passed through the kind of the hatch on the right. And then when they went, ooh, we're not sure, I could write them other persuasive reports going kind of, this one is going to be great. And on the strength of it, I got a publisher's advance of £1/3 of £2,000. So it was in fact the publisher's advance of the beast. It was £666 66p, which I thought was this is January 1990, and I thought, I'm in the money. I have hit the big time. I don't need a job anymore. The freelance life now beckons. And on the strength of having £666 66p in my bank, I gave up my job and went off to be a freelance writer. And
with the sign of the beast in your bank account.
Yeah.
You didn't recall I wonder if the eye of Sauron was upon you as you moved?
No, I didn't. No. The eye of my bank manager was quite rapidly upon me. But I lived in. I had lucked into a very cheap place to live in South London on the top floor of a doctor's surgery, which a friend of mine, who was one of the people I'd found who I could get on with, was already living and told me about. And the deal was that so long as I never asked for any repairs or for the leaks to be fixed, and so long as we would ring the police if somebody broke into the surgery to try and steal the drugs on the ground floor, the doctors basically charged a peppercorn rent. So on the basis of almost zero outgoings and an ability to make hummus myself out of tins of chickpeas, I set off with my £666, and then led an extremely threadbare and hand-to-mouth life of writing book reviews and doing other stuff, writing my first book. But I wasn't poor, because I was what I was playing at being skint while doing exactly what I wanted to do.
Yeah. So what was going on in you in this period, apart from any hubris of moving on? And you talked about being a late developer. Was this a time you look back on and think, I'm going to overlay some words here, I hope it's okay. Was this a season for something to germinate in you or come to life, or
it was the point at which I let myself fall over. I got carried beyond the edge of education. I'd stopped having a job. If I was depressed and broke, I could just be depressed and broke. So it was the beginning of the long delayed reckoning with having run away from human emotion, and the beginning in some ways of my actual education in being a competent adult, which took a very long time to keep going. It's a pity that I didn't fall over more thoroughly then, because there were various chickens still to come home to roost later on, in my 30s.
Were you conscious of that sort of development in you, or was it just happening to you because it had to happen to you at that point?
It was, I think the second. It was happening to me because it had to happen to me. Among the very basic things I didn't learn till much later is that if you are a bit depressive, it's actually quite a good idea to have a busy life. That activity, if it's good activity, makes you happy, and that sitting around feeling that there are kind of no walls to your life, but also nothing to hold you, is actually a recipe for unhappiness. But since I was a stubborn little so-and-so, I had to learn that by doing it. And there are good things about being stubborn as well. And I think I have felt able to do some of the daftly rewarding things I've written about because I was too stubborn not to. But I've also stubbornly insisted on finding out myself in slow motion some things which other people could just have told me if I'd been willing to be taught.
Wow. So this first book that you write here is I May Be Sometime.
It is.
Ice and the English Imagination. I mean, we've already got a little window into how this happened and took place. Were you going through all of these books and think there is a huge gap in the market?
No,
for this
book.
Not. Why this topic, and why this?
Because during my process of randomly picking up and reading things, I had, as a student who should, of course, have been doing something else, picked up and read the ancient dark pink early Penguin duo, the 2 volumes of The Worst Journey in the World, which is the single best book ever written about polar exploration, about by a participant, about Captain Scott's last expedition to Antarctica, and I didn't expect to be moved by it, partly because I wasn't very good at being moved by books anyway, but also because I thought I disapproved politically of all this kind of stiff upper-lipped imperial stuff in which a bunch of men and only men go off to challenge the mighty forces of nature and stuff. But something in it reached through a cranny and moved me. Something, looking back, about a kind of experience of secular wonder and transcendence in that story. And I was mightily puzzled by why it got to me like that. And I could see that it was a complicated not just the experience I was having, but that what had gone into it was complicated, and that most of the writing about it was this kind of either sort of debunking, kind of down with those flannelled fools with their stiff upper lips kind of writing, or old-fashioned Scott of the Antarctic Ladybird book heroism, and that nobody seemed to be willing to get into the kind of the inwardness of it and talk about what this bunch of Edwardian officers and gentlemen and scientists and sailors, this extraordinary, overwhelming thing that had happened to them, which many of them spent the rest of their lives trying to process. And I thought, if you wanted to genuinely explore this, you'd have to write about it, the whole run up to it. You have to write about the kind of history of feeling that was inside it, and that nobody has written a book like that, and nobody cares about this stuff, but I can see how to do it. And I'm in a position to bend a publisher's ear, because there I am sitting at my large green manual typewriter and so on. So that was what I did. And it let me do something entirely self-defined. It let me make lots and lots of first book mistakes, which again, if I'd been willing to be taught, I might have avoided, but I learned some good stuff too. So looking back on it, it's like it's a book with an insane amount of fretwork in it. It's like a kind of mad curly garden shed made in the form of a pagoda by somebody who refuses to go to B&Q to see what garden sheds look like, but goes kind of, I think it should have an enormous golden orb on the roof.
So, I mean, yeah, so as a history of feeling, and I mean, I've dipped my toes into it, and it is expansive, and I know it's your first book, but it's so very redolent of your later books in terms of this abductive style, you know, it's your emotions. And I'm wondering, now I've been doing this interview with you, I had a very different picture of you, of the person you would be when you came to start writing. So this truculent, private, non-attentive to processing emotions and responsibility decides to write a book on the history of feelings with some of the greatest historical characters for the mythology of responsibility. And was it therapeutic? I guess I'm asking, was it therapeutic for you at this point?
I would absolutely have denied it at the time, but yes, of course it was. And
it's not life experience. It's
framing it as we're framing it in this conversation. I see, in fact, a process of by which my truculent younger self nevertheless finds his way to something he needed to think about. So it was the breadcrumb trail that led out of the forest, though I didn't know it at the time. I found some kind of complicated, historically distanced feeling which needed investigating, which put me into the world of feeling. And as you say, responsibility as well, about immensely responsible feeling. So I rebelled my way back towards feeling and responsibility.
Wow.
Suddenly.
Well, wonderful to know that. It means I will go and read it now.
It contains insane amounts of fretwork, and you could probably read the last chapter, and it contains everything that the book should have said. Because by the time I got to the end, I'd worked out how to do it more simply.
Yeah. So your writing career develops. You don't starve to death or overdose on chickpeas.
No. I have no responsibilities. My diet can consist largely of lentils. Yeah.
Great. And this interest seems to develop infusing history and fiction.
Yes.
So which brings me to Read Plenty, which again, I mean, you know, we have this book and we get to read. How do we get from there to here?
Several things have happened in between here. The Child That Books Built has come out and has done quite well, and one of my undeserved advantages has made itself felt, which is that I appear to be quite good at stubbornly and for entirely my own reasons coming up with subjects which other people are going to get interested in later on. So there was a wave of interest in polar exploration, and Kenneth Branagh playing Shackleton and stuff happened conveniently as my book came out. And then I wrote The Child That Books Built, and Harry Potter became an enormously big thing. But I just thought I was eccentrically investigating children's writing, and then suddenly the whole world was full of adults reading Harry Potter on, on the tube in special adult-friendly covers and things. And I wrote a book about technology. Which was also a way of feeling my way into kind of recent British history and trying to explain kind of sidelong what had happened to the world that you and I had grown up in, and how it had changed so radically during the kind of the Thatcher years and then onwards into the 21st century. All of which were non-fiction, but of a kind of sort of secretly personal kind, in which I was giving myself the education that I wouldn't let anyone else give me. And then I thought I would make an equally eccentric decision to write this book about the Soviet Union and about this weird moment in the late 50s, early 60s, when Yuri Gagarin was in orbit and they appeared to be winning the Cold War. And it was another lost world. It was a world that had gone away when communism fell, which happened when I was 26 thereabouts. So it seemed like the most permanent part of the planet, and then suddenly it was gone. And then I realized I had lived on into a time in which people didn't think about it anymore. And so I thought I had a non-fictional wish to investigate that piece of history and to bring it back to life again in a non-fictional way. And I went off to Russia to do some interviews, and nobody would talk to me, because all of the people, I mean, in the nicest, politest, have a glass of vodka kind of way, all of the people I wanted to interview had grown up in the Soviet Union, where it's a very basic survival skill that if strangers turn up and go, "What do you really think about politics?" You go, that's not really my cup of tea. Have some vodka or a cup of tea. So I couldn't do my non-fiction kind of bag of tricks on them because they wouldn't play for excellent reasons. And I can remember thinking as I flew despondently back from Russia, I wish I could just make it up. And then 10 seconds later, I can't make it up, but could this be told as a novel? Then 10 seconds after that, no, not quite, because there's going to be like a kind of gritty layer of explanation that I can't fit into a novel. It won't be a novel, but it might be kind of like a novel. And then by the time I'm back in England, I'm scribbling excitedly. And there are two things going on there, and one of it is me going, my bag of tricks won't work. I want to write about Russia. This way seems to work, which is a kind of technical explanation. But there's also me going, oh, I've been putting off trying to write the kind of books I really love for 20 years now. Isn't it about time you dared to write something with characters and dialogue in it? And it let me creep up sideways on that. So I wrote a kind of half a novel, a novel with a kind of, it was a sort of tree of history with fictional fruit hanging on it, and it let me learn how to do it. And again, I was lucky in that the weirdness was something people took to, and my mother, who was still alive at this point and hadn't yet got dementia, was reassuringly encouraging about this, because my parents had been watching me living on lentils.
I was going to ask, what was your relationship with your parents at this point, and were they telling you to get a proper job or something?
On their, and they were anxious but in fact, they were very anxious looking back, but much too polite to just do the actual, much too polite, much too middle class in some ways to do the what are you doing kind of thing. It was only when I eventually got a university job teaching writing that both of them gave this kind of massive sigh of relief, and I could see that they had been waiting for me for 20 plus years for me to get a proper job, in which they had been worrying steadily. But this makes it all the more impressive that my mother, who had been worrying about me being broke and apparently not getting on with the business of adult life at all, given all that, me going, hey, I've learned how to write nonfiction now and I can make a kind of living, so I've decided to throw it up and do something else. Instead of going, are you mad, my son, went, yes, you should certainly try that, which I think is verging on saintly, actually, looking back, and I'm not sure that I could do that to my daughter. But for encouragement for risk-taking, she was very good. And of course, it was a safer world. My overheads had been low, and I had the middle class safety blanket underneath me. I wasn't risking much compared to almost everybody else. Again, I was never poor. I was only temporarily and by my own choice kind of without money. But then I had the only reason I was without money is that I wanted something else more. So
yeah. Well, so if I just come back to the child that books built, fascinating to know, riding a little, you said, on the coattails in some ways of Harry Potter, but we know it's a cult classic in children's literature circles. How long had the idea of building your own history into a book? Did it just come to you at once? Was it over a period of time?
It began with a curiosity, which was personal. And just as the book about the Poles had begun with me going, why am I moved by this? What's going on in here? This one went, why did I read as a child in a way that was like somebody kind of diving into a swimming pool and not coming up again? Why was it that immersive and kind of eager and desperate? So the question I wanted to answer was always in part about myself, but it broadened out into kind of the books that went with the times I'd grown up in, and just a bigger curiosity about what happens when children read. But there tends to be a personal curiosity, even if it's not apparent. There was a personal curiosity even in writing about Soviet central planning, because it was how come the world changed and no one seems to be able to remember what we all took for granted? One of the paradoxes of my life as a writer is that I realize now it was only when I started writing fiction that my writing got less personal, that the non-fiction was full of stuff that was in there because I cared about it. It was only once I was finally mature enough to start writing novels that I became more outward directed and started thinking about characters who were not like me at all and what the world looked like to them, and started treating writing and reading as a form of proper curiosity about everyone else and what the planet is like for them.
Yeah. Well, in that sense, that leads me on to my next question. And we've laughed a little at your, the younger you doing this writing would not be able to admit the therapeutical nature of it, that that the you today can. And obviously, and it sounds like you reached a point of expression that let you move on to these other things that you grew into. But if we could just for a moment, What was it like? How did you engage with your parents, who must be reading this most personal side of you? Did you have to warn them in advance? Did you hope they wouldn't read it? Did you? What happened?
Okay. The scary one was The Child That Books Built, of course, because it's the most memoir-like one, and because it was offering a version of my childhood which was, I mean, it wasn't rude about them. It wasn't hostile to them. But it was a way of saying goodbye forever to the child who thought he had to prove he was okay. It was something in which I got to go, here are the ways in which I wasn't okay, as well as the ways in which I was. And it told my version of the family story. And as families go, our family was quite inclined to narrate. It had, if not an official version, then one that readily came out. And my mother was, in some ways, its guardian. She had the story by which she had made sense of the things that had turned out to be very, very hard in their marriage and our family life. And it was a redemptive story for her. And her book, Celebration, is I mean, that's a hard-won name for a book about chronic pain and having a terminally ill child.
Do you recognize yourself in that? It's a beautiful juxtaposition. You're owning your own story, and I love that word, redemption. Obviously, Celebration, I've just ordered my copy of it, dipped into it on Google Books. But did you and your mother, was there this sort of ability to articulate consciously with each other the trading of these stories? Like I said at the beginning, your mother talked about her own the charism. I mean, this is helping me understand how she could describe the charism of herself was her story.
Yes.
And here is her son.
Her story was
his own story.
Her story was extremely powerful within the family, and without her trying to crowd out anybody else's story, her story for her was a lifeline. It was a version of our history that allowed space for redemption. It was a charism, and I hadn't known whether there was space for another version of the story which was mine. And in some ways, what I was resisting was a story of redemption. The person who wrote The Child That Books Built didn't believe in redemption yet, and wanted to push it away enough for there to be room for there to be my untidy story, which was not hostile to her story, but which was different and which was mine. And so it was a quite nerve-wracking thing to offer her the finished book. And I have to say, we never talked about it in detail, except for her to say, I'm not upset, I'm not hurt, I'm not offended, I'm glad you wrote it. My father said, did you have to put in the anecdote about me being mistaken for a curate because I would order half pints of lemonade in pubs in mining areas? But the thing I'd worried about was that I would make them look ridiculous by saying that neither of them could identify Elvis, despite having been born in the 50s, brought up in the 50s, and since they still didn't know who Elvis was, this passed them completely by as a source of embarrassment. They were very strong characters and quite unworldly people anyway, who lived in their heads and in the history they worked on, and who had then been through the mills of kind of suffering and the immense labor of keeping a family going under difficult circumstances, and they really didn't have a great deal of time for stuff in popular culture. They were the least foot tapping people you ever did see, and I understand why. But no, we never had the conversation that put together as adults the two stories.
Did your books ever make it onto their bookshelves?
It's on their bookshelves. I have been gradually clearing their bookshelves because I inherited the house, but it's there, and they were proud of it. And I suspect that though they were too polite to say so, they were relieved that I had started to kind of crack the facade and to let myself be perturbed. But actually, you know, just as a child, knowing my mother would quite like me to be upset did not tempt me to be upset, but rather the opposite. It was difficult to do, and it remains, I know, quite a private and hedged kind of piece of writing. I mean, I look at memoir now, and mine is very guarded. It goes, I will blurt out some difficult stuff, but then I will insist on telling you for pages and pages and pages about Jean Piaget and his theories of child development. It's not a kind of let it all hang out memoir.
So, Francis, on reading your books, and as someone myself, I know deep introspection. I know one of the ways to disguise the deepest parts of yourself is to offer a great deal of vulnerability to others, knowing it's only the tip of the iceberg. So I quite understand, but I'm quite a self-disclosing. People say, "Oh, you're so down." I'm like, you have no idea how far down this goes. This is a safety feature.
Absolutely, no. We're talking about the same phenomenon here, and I am a blurter of apparently private truths, and I'm still somebody quite confident that there are locked safes within locked safes within locked safes. The religious difference for me is that I'm willing to believe in something that reaches to the inmost cash box within the most tightly locked safe.
Yeah, thank you. So, moving on a little bit into life here, we're on the home straight, sort of, in that you've had this very private book, all these genres spanning reading, writing. You talk about having moved into science fiction, and wonderfully honest about with pornography as well, as everyone does, every young man does. How long did it take you? See if this question makes sense. How long did it take you to find a structure for your reading, writing, where you had boundaries that you could observe between your public self and your private self in terms of your constructions? That question makes sense, Francis.
It does make sense.
I suppose it's that sort of iceberg. Yeah, it's where is there enough of me that I know and enough out there, and it's in my right. That's not.
It's difficult to answer because it's still a work in progress. I am still quite capable of startling people with a piece of ill-timed overconfidence, which then causes me to run away afterwards, going, writing allows for second thoughts and third thoughts, so it's better in writing than it is in person. All right, again, weirdly, although, and I read plenty, which was half a novel, before I wrote Unapologetic, which is my last piece of non-fiction, and also a very personal book. In a way, it's been my turn towards fiction, which has given me a secure distinction between what's private and what's public, because fiction gives you a way to attend fully to kind of to the felt life and the life of emotions and perceptions in a way which isn't just you. I mean, fiction gets quarried out of your own inner material a lot, of course, but not only. And it gets transformed as it's done, because what you're doing with it is you are subjecting it to the discipline of making it the story of other people. And that's the point where I start to be able to observe the boundary more securely. Once I'm making stuff up securely, and once I feel, and it's ironic to me looking back that I was wary of fiction for a long time because I was scared of self-revelation in it. I was frightened that I would just kind of leak or bleed onto the page in this helpless way. Whereas actually it's been the opposite. My years of helpless leaking were those in which I was writing non-fiction about apparently completely impersonal things. And the explicitly emotional world of fiction is one with much better boundaries, because I'm
wonderful. As it sounds like you've finished this work. It's a rite of passage. Yeah. It lets you move into adulthood.
There's an appalling Terry Pratchett pun in which someone does a spell in a corridor and someone else says, "Marry, it was a rite of passage," and you.
What's if your truculence was 10 on a scale of 1 to 10, through teenage years and university, when this book was released, when it was well received, when the fears of not being good enough or capable of writing had all receded, where was your truculence on a scale of 1 to 10 at this point?
It down to a manageable. We've left out something important here, which is kind of
what's that?
Crash, grace, redemption, mercy, conversion.
That's what we're just about to go to.
I thought we might be. All right, my truculence level eases down from a whopping 10 to an antsy 6 or so, I would say. But then,
you haven't arrived. I think you're about to tell me you haven't arrived at the place of further on and further in. Even
I have not.
No.
At which point I mess up big time, in a way that I have to be careful about how I talk about, because it's not just my secret, and also I remain a reasonably private person. I get married. To somebody I've known and loved for years and years and years, but don't take the elementary precaution of telling her everything about myself, and keep a number of secrets that are incompatible with being comfortably married, and which are, as it turns out, very destructive and scary for somebody whose own history is complicated. And manage within the first couple of years of the apparently glorious new beginning of being married to kind of pull the house down around both our ears emotionally. I make a complete and compulsive mess of things, because everything I've been too scared to attend to about myself over the years of solitary truculence now comes home to roost at once. And I make somebody I care about very, very unhappy, and I fall over myself into despair, at which, for the first time, my truculence rating stops being the most important thing about me. And this is the point at which I am unable to avoid coming face to face with a very unflattering picture of myself and my various refusals and self-indulgences and destructive little ways, and I have no idea what to do about this in my mid-30s, and we separate, and I appear to have ruined everything I ever wanted. And the books and my various kinds of carefully knitted, secretly private, locked safe cleverness don't look like much of a consolation. Because in my quest to demonstrate to my mother 30 years previously that actually I wasn't all right, I have managed to create large amounts of selfish havoc, and I don't know my way out of this. At which point something happens, and but as I said earlier in the conversation, there's something that happens I then later, for good reasons of my own, described in writing. So there's now a difficulty in remembering what actually happened, and what the redemptive thing was like at the time, as opposed to the way I thought, kind of, this could be organized into several well-ordered paragraphs, and this will be a very effective way of putting it.
We're on to the cafe story and the motor.
We are on to the cafe story. But the cafe story is true. The cafe story is true. The only problem is that in writing, and it was as true as I could make it when I wrote it down too. No. The problem with it is that it's a story, and what happened to me wasn't a story. What happened to me was a formless, shapeless mess, in which I appeared to be recognizing about myself something I could not see any hope in at all, because I had no idea of what to do with it or how to get out of it. And I really did sit miserably in a cafe, and they really did play the slow movement of Mozart's clarinet concerto just as part of their restful things in cafes, tape loop. And something was delivered in it and through it and by it to me, which was a message of wordless, very important that it was wordless, because I am a clever little bugger, and I know how to make things happen with words, and I would not have trusted, I suspect, something that came to me in words, because I can see how words are put together, and anyway. So music rather than words, this tender, undenying sound, which did not offer any hope at all, in the sense that it was denying the mess I'd made. It didn't go kind of, cheer up, sunshine, there are also skipping lambs and these attractive flowers. It went, boy, what a mess you've made, and the mess you've made sounds as sad as this, but that's not all there is. That's not all there is to it. As well as all of the sorrow you have brought down on yourself and someone you love's head, there is also this, and you don't have to do anything about it, and you don't have to reason about it, and you don't have to deserve it. That's the most important thing of all. You don't have to deserve it. And part of tidying it into narrative when I wrote it down was the suggestion that as a turning point, everything then changed. And of course, it wasn't really quite like that. It fitted into it fitted into a process. But I was, from that point, open to the news that there might be something just as true as the mess I'd made, which I didn't have to deserve. There might be a form of comfort available, which was true comfort, not a clever little so-and-so's ability to make a nice screen. And when I was writing about it later, I tried, partly because I was writing apologetics and I was in a state of battle with my not just with my inner atheist as well as with various outer really existing atheists over there. Partly because I was I can't remember where I'm going with this. I was needing to fend off the idea that I'd only fallen back into Christianity because it was culturally available, because there's that well-known kind of new atheist move that goes, you say your religion is true, but there are loads of religions and everybody else thinks theirs is true too, therefore none are. And I was mindful of that, and I didn't want to. So when I was writing it up afterwards, I wanted to give all due truthful weight the role played by my childhood church experience. There it was. I had a pattern ready to put a religious experience into, and that's true. Churches were there. I knew I'd been confirmed just before instantly losing my faith. Thank you, Church of England. I'm still glad about that, actually. So yes, in some ways it made cultural sense that I didn't start tentatively going into mosques or Sikh gurdwaras or Hindu temples or synagogues, but churches. But I thought that by acknowledging this, I could also kind of take the sting out of it, because I wouldn't have continued to go very tentatively into churches had I not found inside them something that specifically fitted my need. And it's not that I'm just reproducing the programming which my evil and manipulative parents installed in me. It's that there was something there which seemed to me to be more true and more true to human experience, and specifically my human experience, than anything else I could see in the landscape. And I'm straightforwardly and unworriedly grateful that I had had enough churching to know what was there, and or no, I didn't know what was there. I had a child's eye view of what was there, but I knew at what address to start looking. And it was also very important that I didn't go to services. I would sneak into churches on my own when I could rely on them being empty. And thanks to the state of British Christianity, it's really quite easy to find an empty church, ladies and gentlemen. And the most important thing as I crept in was finding that churches were genuinely empty, that the cloud of omnipotent parent-like bullying pressure which had seemed to fill them when I was 14 and 15 had gone, as if it had never been. And indeed that I went hungrily into churches, looking for them, hoping for them to being full, and and being, if anything, frustrated that they seemed to be empty. The penny did eventually drop that going at times when there were other people there might have something to offer. Church is not, in fact, something you can do completely on your own, but finding my way out of being reflexively solitary was part of the process. But church is gloriously empty, not bullying, but apparently, and then more steadily offering a wordless clarinet from somewhere or other.
Well, as I read your story, as poignant and painful and sharp as it was, and it was a sacred moment to read it, that kind of a gift to give to others. And in the course of this interview, I'm hearing that we talked about if the rest of the iceberg was hidden away, that at the end of the success of the child that books built is the iceberg manifests over this night. You find yourself in this cafe, and in your own words, it's beautiful the way you narrate yourself with all the caveats that you've made. This inner voice of, you fucked up, my heart's broken, I'm inconsolable, I go into a bookshop. And then this beautiful piece of music plays. And I must admit, as I was reading that, and again, and I know this, I guess, as a writer and a storyteller, that other people bring their own interpretations of those stories. That's the gift giving in a story. And I'm listening to this, and one thought comes to mind, and I thought, good grief, this is a Manchurian, I can imagine a cynical atheist. This is his Manchurian Candidate moment. The music activates his inner Anglican to deal with the existential crisis he's facing. And then I thought,
let the record show that I have not tried to assassinate any public figures.
No bishops were harmed in this conversion. But then the second thought that came to mind was, I thought, no, I know what this reminds me of and is redolent to me. And it's in The Magician's Nephew. There's that moment in The Magician's Nephew, it's chapter 9, and Aslan sings. He sings the song that brought the world into creation.
Yes.
And you're writing at that point in your story, as I'm like, I can hear the Narnia. I can hear the music, as you said, that abducts you. It's not words. It's transcendent at that point. It's subconscious. It's subterranean, and then this whole hinterland that you talked about. It's your inheritance from your parents. Suddenly, it's all available to you. Yeah. That's what. Sorry, if I'm allowed to overlay that on you, that's one of the ways that I read that moment.
But gradually. It's too tidy to suggest that the kind of the back of the wardrobe opens at that very moment. But yes, yes.
I mean, as again, to stretch the analogy, as Aslan sings, the witch is still there, and there's a whole lot of things that have to happen.
No, I was
poison. One of the phrases Lewis talks about is the poison slowly goes away as the singing builds and people join in the song.
I was sung into Christianity by, as I say in there, Mr. Mozart, the well-known dead Austrian, in a week.
You were. And in preparation for today, of course, I thought I will read that moment and listen to the Adagio, as I'm sure many people have. And then I thought, for me, there was another piece of music that seemed more evocative of that moment and the rest of your work, and it's actually the oboe concerto by Vaughan Williams.
I don't know the oboe concerto by Vaughan.
Yeah, was stunning. I think your life goes well for me reading it to some Vaughan Williams in the background. Yeah. One last thought on that moment, whatever you want to call it or describe it, also reminded me of the power of music. You stand in good stead in history with people like Augustine, who is beside himself, realizes his life is a mess, is inconsolable in his own words in the Confessions, and then hears a song, take up and read, a children's song.
Coming over the wall into the garden.
Exactly. Have you ever made that connection yourself with this moment?
Not until much, much later, because I hadn't read the Confessions until much, much later, and I'm still, given that the way that they're constructed requires you to flip backwards and forwards between memoir and heavy-duty theology, I still haven't read the whole of the Confessions, but yes, he's a very reassuring saint, Augustine. He goes on screwing up for so long.
I'm reading you. You fucked up. My heart is broken. I'm inconsolable. That's that moment for all. That's his exact words.
Yeah, I know. And then
phrase.
Which go kind of. And I knew that, but then I moved to Carthage and did it some more.
Don't tell anyone. Wonderful. Well, thank you for letting us dwell there in that place with this. We've got to pick up the how people are. Is it tempted to fuck up?
The human propensity to fuck up. But that's
propensity to fuck up. The acronym. Is there a way to pronounce this acronym?
I decided that the HPTFTU. I decided that I had recorded the audio book of it.
Oh,
so I had to decide, and I decided that the appropriate sound was a sound rather like somebody kind of spitting into a bucket. So the yeah.
Yeah. Could you explain that acronym?
Yeah, because. Okay, so I've started being a novelist, but then I double back because although there is a novel I can see I ought to be writing, I get very indignant and worked up about the not the hostility to Christianity in the New Atheist stuff, but how amazingly thoroughly they seem to miss the felt point of it, as far as I'm concerned. That what they're describing is a million miles off. That the conversation they want to have is just at the wrong place. So I want to write a book which. No, I don't want to write it. I want somebody else to write it. It's one of those classic. I wanted somebody else to write it, but they wouldn't. Books. I could see the possibility of a book which would go, you're talking about the wrong thing. But to talk about the right thing, given where our culture now is, we can't do what apologetics in previous generations did and just go kind of, actually the synoptic gospels are really well attested and considered as first century biographies. That's which for some people is a very important consideration, but not for that many that I know of, and that we are a long way away from the memory of Christianity. So that in order to explain what the conversation ought to be about, you'd have to start a really long way back. Later on, reading about Lewis thinking his way into apologetics, I realized that there was an absolutely parallel calculation he'd made when the BBC come to him in 1940 and go, will you do us something about Christianity? And he goes, wouldn't I have to explain a few things first? But you now have to get several stages back before the things that C.S. Lewis thought you had to explain first, and that you'd need a book which started well away and then carried people assuming nothing and then explaining everything as it went along towards what the point of Christianity's redemptive story was, and that in the first place you'd have to explain what people need redeeming from. And it's not that people still have a very lively sense of evil, but that something had gone unusably wrong with the word sin, except for kind of conversation between people who are already within the faith, because the word sin had become so much a piece of marketing speak for things that were like cream cakes, naughty but nice, things that were a little bit of what you fancy that does you good, and a bit of kind of ooh la la, and a bit of you know, chocolates, and as I said, lingerie in which the color red predominates. I mean, and general enjoyable naughty wickedness which nobody with in their right mind would get upset about. So the word seemed to me to be an obstacle, an actual block in making the point that actually the story about redemption that we want to offer you here, one about the kind of mess and evil you take seriously, not about lingerie. So we need a place-holding term which can be defined on the fly, which won't have the distracting wrong associations. And I thought I will put swearing into it, because swearing, as everyone knows, is big and clever. I have a slightly longer and more serious justification for why there's swearing in a book of apologetics, but that will do for now. It's got swearing in it, so it will startle people into taking it as a piece of current colloquial speech, not some sort of weird religious technicality. And it will be memorably weird. The human propensity to fuck up, human propensity to fuck things up, because it's not just accidents and pratfalls, it's the whole domain in which people deliberately do destructive stuff, and everybody actually knows about that. They're just very resistant to seeing it under the heading of whipped cream and red lingerie. So we say the human propensity to fuck things up, which you spell out. People go, fuck things up, but this is a religious book. And then you can shorten it to HPT, FTU, and then it just becomes this little block of printed words, an unsayable and gradually you can build into it everything that the word sin historically meant, with no whipped cream attached to it. One of the ways in which the book got misread later, which rather saddened me, was Christians going he wants to define, he's not interested in sin, he wants to come up with his own definition. No, I'm interested in exactly the same thing as before. It's just a term that's supposed to like a conjurer sort of forcing a card, is designed to get people to take seriously everything that the old term meant.
It was genius. I mean, that's why I get my students to read it, a sort of, a neologism of some sort that you get to bundle up with what you mean. Yeah. That is not just, it's what's the phrase? It becomes an illocutionary shell noun of sorts that just, it just builds and builds and builds and builds. And for the people that I think you were trying to reach with the book, it does.
Yeah. And actually, or at least I flatter myself that it gets less profane as it goes on being used, because you stop noticing what the F stands for. It becomes an arbitrary signifier which you're mostly paying attention to the meaning of.
And it allows the reader to move from the concrete identification with their own lives. Oh gosh, yes. And then on your personal anecdotes, to move into the abstract and the conceptual in a way that you need to, so that you can then re-narrate yourself and discover a different way to come back into the world. That's certainly how I read it.
Absolutely. And so that you can see other people whose Perpetual is different from yours, but not push them to arm's length as examples of a kind of wickedness in which you can find no resemblance to yourself. It allows for, I hope, the International League of the Guilty, which is what I came up with for the church, to to mean something. Because one of the worst things morally that our culture does is to alternate between a pretense of unconvincing innocence and panic about evil. We keep pushing it away to arm's length, and we keep demanding that special classes of exemplarily disgusting, wicked people carry the whole weight of our own self-dislike and self-distrust. And the first step out of that, it seems to me, is to recognize the ways in which we actually resemble those special, disgusting people, and in which they might be less disgusting than we think, and we might be possibly slightly more.
Well, I am a trained theologian with a PhD in theology, and I do some work with my students on, because your book is replete with wonderful theology, a theological anthropology of understanding people, but also your chapter on Jesus is just staggering as a Christological retelling of the concept of, I can't even pronounce the acronym, I won't try. But just before we go there, we're getting quite close to the end, Francis. Just dwell a little bit, the new atheists. I know that's the background in which you're writing, and I love the way that even if you're aware this book takes place in the midst of that and wanting to speak to a different issue, once you're into the book, the new atheists, they're left behind.
They are at the wrong address talking about the stuff I didn't want to talk about. So the idea was to turn up on the fringes of the crowd to which Richard Dawkins was preaching, annoying word deliberately chosen, swear eye-catchingly, and then carry off his attentions I'd managed to snag to a completely different location to talk about something completely different. It was difficult, having come up with a voice which was, I tried to make the positive most of my own qualities of stubbornness and kind of orneriness. I quite enjoyed doing polemic, but it involved manufacturing a voice that was more profane and more blokey in some ways than my own natural speaking voice actually is. It's true about me, but it's only part of the truth about me. And it was then tricky to change gear enough from the kind of boom qualities of that voice to get into a broad enough, gentle enough theological anthropology, and particularly to start narrating the gospel in the middle of the book in a way that I hoped was fresh enough to be heard and still had the kind of the shocking qualities of it as a story, and was still doing the kind of, in some ways, childishly rude aspects of it, like recasting paganism as being as ridiculous as I made it sound, and yet to be trying to pay the most faithful attention of which I was capable to Christ as what T.S. Eliot calls the infinitely patient, infinitely suffering thing, that's not a blokey observation. It's not a sweary observation. It's not a knockabout observation. So it was getting there was actually the harder task of the book.
Well, it was wonderful that you did. Last thing on the new atheist, I'm just, I'm a big fan of Steven Pinker and his reading, but
I'm a big fan of Richard Dawkins, explainer of molecular biology. He's a great writer.
But you realise the emotional hijacking that takes place. So Steven Pinker's book on the Enlightenment is fantastic, apart from, the complete unwillingness to see any antecedent from Christianity that makes the world possible that he stands in and observes things. So the French Enlightenment is just totally missing.
I know.
From the book. Here's what rationalism leads to. It's one of the bloodiest moments in history.
Sorry, we're now both waving.
I'm saying you realise that we're all emotional. That even these most rational of atheists, their real navigation through life is an embodied emotional experience for the story that they're in. They tell themselves another story, but that's, like you say, it's not the real story. There's another story going on.
There is. And the idea, I always find the particular new atheist fallback that goes, we have no views, no vision. All we are is a principled refusal to engage in to engage with entities whose existence cannot be proved. And you think that is such a palpably untrue description of the emotional tenor of your atheism, which is passionate, which is a deeply emotional cause for you, and is to do with the vindication of truth and the saving of the world from malignant nonsense. It's a quest for goodness you're on, and I can hear that. So
that's the place to engage.
Yeah.
So you're not only a practicing Christian, you're now married to a vicar.
I am.
I thankfully, in our email correspondence with Simon, I got a little sneaky look at her book. I've actually ordered it today from Amazon. Was she at any point advising you? Did you have any theological? That's the larger question. Was she your principal theological advisor at any point?
Yeah. Yes. She was. She's also my principal theological influence, because she is a wonderful preacher, and I've been listening to her sermons now for numbers of decades. I am very strongly influenced by her, and I ran by her each bit I wrote. Now it's still me, and the errors are still mine, and the sense of where it's important to put the emphasis is mine, but no, I am deeply and permanently indebted to her as.
So, if I may, again, a cheeky question: anything that she said to you, no, you can't have that in there, or you shouldn't, and anything that you remember saying, oh, I wouldn't say it like that you can recall?
No, actually. But there is a major thing, which she said, I can see this is integral to the design of the book. I can see that you are using your own sense of guilt and shared guilt to explain where redemption comes from. And that's such a kind of foundational decision for the book that it wouldn't make sense to talk about other equally powerful pathways into faith. But there are, she said, and you should be aware that you're leaving them out. And she also says her judgment of me is that thanks to my history, I'm so stuck on the sense of myself as guilty and in need of mercy, that I tend to undervalue judgment as one of God's gifts, and that she says my characteristic mistake is to read the Psalms and get upset because of all the things that they say are going to happen to the wicked, because I associate myself with the wicked. But she points out, this is because I am safe and warm and not being currently oppressed. And were I hiding in a cellar while the Babylonians came by, I would probably be strongly in favor of God smiting the ungodly. And that it's actually quite important that in Exodus, God patiently goes, no, you really do need to let my people go. No, you really do. And it's only after after Pharaoh has started killing the Israelite firstborn that God goes, have a taste of your own medicine, mate. That there is a world of, that if you don't take justice for granted, there is a world of of righteous longing there, which religion feeds, which I tended not to pay attention to because I was so busy going, I'm unrighteous.
Well, maybe some future projects for you, which brings me on to, I've got two questions for you to finish. So this penultimate question is this: what are you currently working on, which we had an allusion to earlier on in the interview?
I have just finished a novel called Light Perpetual, which is set in London from 1944 to kind of now-ish. Anyone who has prayed the Anglican or Catholic prayer for the dead will know where Light Perpetual comes from, but quite a lot of the people who read the book with any luck won't. It's a novel about South London and time and eternity. The book begins with a V2 falling on, as happened on the Woolworths in New Cross near where I teach, falling on a full branch of Woolworths and as did in fact happen, killing lots of people, including lots of children who therefore didn't get to live through the rest of the 20th century. So the book is a reimagining of the lives that 5 children killed by this V2 would have had. It is a kind of call for grace. It is about, in Blake's line, eternity being in love with the productions of time. It's about it's a psalm of praise for existence and about what we all hope in our prayers for the dead and for a love which stretches from the living to the dead seamlessly. God is capable of doing, but it's not a confessional book, and you should be able to read it. You will notice that there's the odd theological bit here, but nobody in it goes to church. In fact, the only person who gets invited to go to church says firmly no.
I'm afraid I'm primed from our conversation for C.S. Lewis allusions. So the Great Divorce is already.
It's in there a bit. You'd have to be primed by Lewis to find the Lewisian things in it, but they're there. What it tries to be is a novel which takes serious in theological terms. I mean, it's a novel which does lots of things, I hope, but in theological terms, it's a novel which tries to take seriously the truth that the Holy Spirit is not only active in those who are consciously religious, that we are talking about the wind that blows where it will, and about the universal spirit of grace, and that it doesn't stop blowing for anyone or anywhere. So it's not a churchy book, but it is, on the quiet with a small r, a religious book about things that get broken and things that get mended and things that can't get mended, and the unlikely forms in which offers of grace come, although nobody plays the clarinet in this one, but there is quite a lot of music.
And is it explicitly, in terms of theology there, is it the kind of, seeds of the word in the world that the church has broadly understood, that God is at work out in the world and we can go and discover that? Is it?
It is. It's about love, not death, having the last word, and love, not time and its ruminations having the last word.
Wonderful. And Amazon informed me that my pre-order will not arrive until February next year.
February the 4th. Sorry, but there was this whole pandemic thing, so everything got a bit delayed.
Oh, is that pushed the release? Yeah.
No, also I just am a really slow writer. And I got sidetracked by the C.S. Lewis project I really shouldn't talk about. So.
Yes, which we shouldn't name. But look forward to 2034 at the latest. So my last question, and again, I've used this a couple of times, I said cheeky question, if I may.
Yeah.
Again, if I had a favourite chapter in Unapologetic, it's the Jesus chapter I mean, you don't even, I can see the, I would not say subterfuge, but even the title, you don't use the English for Jesus. Immediately we're having to decipher and discover this Jesus that you've made this. I think I've been a Christian long enough now that you made the familiar strange in an engaging way that was wonderful. And I guess that also, the whole purpose of the book that we talked about is, discovering something that you thought actually isn't what you thought really. So the cheeky question is this. I mean, as I read that chapter, because of your autobiography that just leaks into everything, I can hint at who Jesus is for you and what he means to you. I mean, it's just it's replete through that chapter. So the cheeky question is this, if I may. Well, at this point, at this juncture, as someone who's managing his truculence and grown up in your own words and moving into the future and writing, what does Jesus mean to you at this point, and as you look to the future? And I'm not asking that in a trite way. I'm saying in terms of your story and who you are and where you're going, out of that chapter, who is the Jesus that you're going into the future with?
He was the aid in catastrophe. He was the first responder to my sins. But that's less true. No, it's not less true. It's other things have been added since then. He's a storyteller and a pattern for storytelling, and something around which the stories I tell magnetically keep being pulled. There's something appropriate to me being 56 in there, that not a man of 33 dying for the sins of a man of 35, not the youthful crash of one's conceit into into truths from which you need an escape, but a pattern now of something steadily glowing in the world for the long haul of hope.
Steadily glowing in the world for the long haul of hope. Gosh, what a beautiful phrase, and what a wonderful place for us to finish. Francis, it has been beyond a privilege to have this conversation today. Thank you so much for who you are and what you continue to give to us and to the world in your writing. Thank you. We hope you enjoyed that, and we have many other interviews with amazing guests where we listen attentively and respectfully to discover people's backstories through their beliefs and life experiences and find out what shaped them into who they are and inspires what they do. You can catch all those interviews by liking and subscribing to our YouTube channel. You can find audio versions in your podcast platform of choice: Apple, Spotify, Google Podcasts, SoundCloud, Stitcher, etc. Just search Extra ECC. Of course, you can go to extraecc.com and sign up for our newsletter and find all our social media links and more. And by the way, all links are in our show notes below.